Hi guys, we'll be looking at the French defense today. So in the French defense, white starts with pawn to e4 and black responds with pawn to e6. So by doing this, black blocks the a2 to g8 diagonal, which is a weakness for black where white generally tends to move his bishop here and attack this diagonal. That's the main idea of moving this pawn to e6. And there's one disadvantage for black here, that this bishop is kind of blocked. So if black wants to develop his bishop, it would be a better idea uh, moving this pawn up and getting the bishop to b7. So white wants to control the center, so moves pawn to d4. Black responds with pawn to d5. So white, there are two variations here. White can either kill this pawn or move in front. The most common variation is uh, white moving pawn in front to keep his control. So now black moves pawn to c5 to keep pressure on this pawn. Now let's look at two variations. One variation is when white takes the pawn. If white takes the pawn, it's uh, advantage for black, as black can just take the pawn with the bishop. This is taking the pawn and developing his bishop. Now if you look at it, black has center control and has a bishop developed, while white has just a pawn in up, pawn in front, and no pieces developed. So this is clearly an advantage for black. So white generally doesn't take the pawn, and white moves knight to f3, supporting this pawn. Black moves knight to c6, keep attacking this pawn, the d4 pawn, and white to support the pawn moves pawn to c3. The most common move for black is queen to b6. There are two reasons of moving this. This adds the pressure on the d4 pawn with three attacks with the knight, pawn, and the queen, and the queen attacks the b2 pawn. So this kind of jams the bishop. So whenever the bishop leaves, the queen can take the b2 pawn. So white generally tends to develop with bishop to e2, and now black can't move his knight to f3 obviously because he's attacking, and he wouldn't want to move to e7 blocking this bishop too. So black moves knight to h6. This might look like a funny move because knight to h6 is generally not played, but the intention is that to tempt white in taking the black taking the knight. So if white takes with the bishop, instead of killing it with the pawn, queen takes this pawn, attacking the rook. So he has two options here. If he moves here, the queen can take the knight. If he moves here, he can't take the rook, nor can he take the knight, but he can continue taking the pawns. And now, as you notice, white is losing the center control and black is taking over the center completely. He'll soon get the d4 pawn too with three attacks and just one support here. So at the end, the black would have taken three white pawns and white would have taken one black knight, which is equal, but white and black ends up having more center control. Now let's look at the second variation of the French defense. So this is when black moves pawn to d5. White, instead of moving the pawn in front, because that variation sees black having a better control, so white generally would move knight to c knight to c3. So this attacks the d5 pawn and is supporting the e4 pawn. So black responds with knight to f6. This is both support, adding a support to this pawn and putting pressure on the e4 pawn. And white would move to e5 to drive away the knight. Knight generally tends can't move here, can move here, but can will be driven again out by the pawn. So the best move for black is knight to d7. This again blocks the bishop. If we look at the position here, white looks like he's in a better position as black has a bishop blocked. His best way of developing the c8 bishop is through use through this through the b uh, pawn, developing the b pawn, while there's nothing blocked for white, so his developing would be faster than black. So this variation has white tends to have a better advantage than black in this variation. So if someone plays the French defense against you, it's best advice to play this variation and not the previous variation. Thank you for watching and subscribe for more videos on openings.